As you probably know, if you're listening to this program, the United Nations Climate Change Conference has been underway in Paris. Our next guest joins us from Paris to talk about that conference. Natasha Geiling is climate reporter for Think Progress. She is covering the conference for that outlet, and she joins us now. Natasha, thanks for coming on the program.
Thanks for having me.
So, I guess I won't throw you with one of those wide open questions like, how's it going? But
Yeah.
how's it going?
Well, it's going. We're in our wrapping up the first week. So it started on Monday with the heads of state coming, which was a change from Copenhagen, which was the last kind of big. I mean, these COPs happen every year, but Copenhagen was sort of the last big kind of world event where all eyes were sort of looking at the conference, and there the heads of state came at the end. Kind of a lot of people credit with sort of derailing the talks right at the end. This time, heads of state were there at the beginning, which everyone thinks kind of set it off on a much better note. But they are now gone, and the negotiators are hard at work, and they have released a draft text, which is long and incomplete, but has in it a few things, some good stuff going on with research and development for green technology, sustainable energy, and then also the question of the 2 degree Celsius limit has been brought up in that draft and seems to be sort of a sticking point. People thought it was going to be all along, but it appears as though it's kind of definitely probably will go well into next week talking about whether 2 degrees is going to be the final wording on that or not.
And for our listeners who may not be familiar with that detail, the 2 degrees is whether or not the nations signing this agreement are willing to commit to policies that will restrict the extent of global warming for, correct me if I'm wrong, and could be, for the remainder of the century to 2 degrees Celsius, right?
Yeah, so limiting global warming by 2100 to 2 degrees Celsius, which is pretty well agreed upon as the kind of limit for when things start to get really dire. I mean, before 2 degrees, you certainly will have issues, but 2 degrees is kind of the upper threshold, a lot of people think, though there are some actors that are here at COP, and mostly the small island nations and developing nations that think that even 2 degrees is going to be catastrophic, and so they're pushing for 1.5 degrees Celsius, which seems like a small difference, but is a big sticking point.
So, and my understanding was, correct me if I'm wrong again, but Natasha Geiling, my understanding was that pretty much it was assumed going in that there would be an agreement to hold to 2 degrees of global warming as a maximum. And is that now you're saying not so clear?
So definitely, I think 2 degrees is pretty well agreed upon. I mean, we saw the G7 conference earlier this year. Those nations all agreed to 2 degrees. 2 degrees, I think, was codified at Copenhagen or maybe even earlier in Kyoto, these things. But it's really a question of a few things. Like I said, whether 2 degrees is enough, which a lot of people think it's not, it doesn't go far enough
right.
To ward off the worst. And then whether or not the commitments that countries have made thus far, so countries have submitted their own pledges to the UN ahead of this conference, they're called INDCs, whether those INDCs actually will get us to 2 degrees of warming. And I think the consensus is that they won't right now.
Okay. And Natasha Geiling of Think Progress, just a slight aside before we go any further, what's it like covering one of these things? I mean, I assume the negotiations take place behind closed doors, and yet a lot of people have come to Paris. What's the environment like? What do you do? What do you see when you're covering a conference like this?
Yeah, so a lot of the talks do happen behind closed doors, but there's a lot going on both in Paris proper and then out at Le Bourget, which is where the talks themselves are happening, and that's a suburb about, if you're on the metro, it's about an hour outside of town proper. And in Paris, I've seen art installations that are going on. I've seen a lot of signs all around town talking about the COP. There are award ceremonies happening that honor various innovators in sustainability, innovators in citywide initiatives. And then out at the COP itself, it's split off even further into three sections. So there's the actual negotiations area that's limited to people with UN credentials. And then there's an outside area that's open to civil society, where a lot of participants like NGOs or organizations such as that set up stands. And then there's a gallery of innovations, people showing off their best ideas for what the future is going to look like, low carbon agriculture projects, low carbon energy projects, things like that. There's a lot going on, and covering it, I wish I had clones of myself. There's, tons going on. I wish I could be in two places at once, but
Yeah, I'm sure. And it sounds, frankly, I mean, despite the gravity of the situation and the concerns, it sounds like it could also be a lot of fun.
yeah, there is an air of kind of levity to it, which is nice. They're at the Generations Climate Space, which is the kind of civil society part of the talks, which is where I was all day today. There was music, there's, different cafes and people eating and people talking and people milling around. And I mean, it's really thousands of people have come to Paris for this. And Paris has been waiting a long time to put these talks on. And so I think there's a real kind of air of a culmination and almost a, celebration, in a way that the talks are happening.
Well, that's great, and also, of course, Paris and or the French government banned demonstrations in the wake of the terror attacks of several weeks ago. But there were, as you and others have reported, there were demonstrations around the world, and people, since there couldn't be any mass demonstrations in Paris itself or in Le Bourget, they left empty shoes, right?
Yeah, they did. There were 20,000 shoes left at the Place de la République. And some of those, Pope Francis sent a pair, Ban Ki-moon sent a pair of running sneakers. And I was not in Paris at the time, so I didn't get to see it in person, but I saw photos and it seems like it was a really.
Now, 20,000 shoes or 20,000 pair of shoes? Because
20,000 shoes, so 10,000 pairs.
10,000 pairs. Okay.
20,000 individual shoes. Yeah, that was something I had to double check.
Okay. Okay. See, we're both reporters here. We want to get the story right. Okay. Natasha Geiling of Think Progress. You also wrote that Republicans are doing everything they can to undermine the American delegation to the Paris climate talks. Perhaps not the most surprising story, but what's interesting is how are they doing it?
Yeah, so both on the campaign trail, just sort of giving stump speeches talking about, it's crazy that in the face of terrorism, both international and domestic, that Obama is out here at this conference spending time talking about climate change. So there, GOP candidates are undercutting it in that way. But in Congress, they've actually taken some concrete actions. And one in particular that may happen, and we'll see, it's sort of a timing thing, but the year-end budget has to be passed by December 11th, or else there will be an imminent government shutdown. And December 11th also happens to be the same time that the climate talks in Paris are wrapping up. And so what some Republicans have proposed to do is to introduce riders into the budget that would stop the government from sending money as part of the Green Climate Fund, which is a fund that goes to help developing nations both mitigate and adapt to climate change. The idea with that is that developed nations like the United States and the EU have had the most historic emissions and therefore kind of like bear the most responsibility for climate change. And so they have a responsibility to pay for developing countries to, mitigate against sea level rise or deploy solar, things like that. So that's the idea of the Green Climate Fund. And Republicans are trying to use that as it sort of hold that fund hostage in the budget, hoping that will, in a sense, spook some of the more important actors like India, who's crucial to these COP talks because India emits a lot of greenhouse gases, but they're also a developing nation. Half of their residents don't have access to electricity, and so there's a huge opportunity there for deployment of solar on a massive scale, which they've talked about, but they need money for that. And so if there's some question of the United States' participation in the Green Climate Fund, then there's some thought that maybe India will be not as willing to come to the table as a participant in a strong deal. And so, by holding it's a little in the weeds. And
No, no,
Obama
no.
has
I
threatened to
think it's
veto.
important. I think it's important. I think
Yeah.
what you're basically saying, Natasha, is that they're using something like that to try to actually influence and undermine the success of the president's negotiations
Yeah.
in Paris. And I think that's extremely important. That's an aspect of this story that hasn't gotten enough coverage. The idea that they would actually undermine the government of the United States in an international negotiation, I think, is a big deal.
Yeah. It's really, I mean, as you said, in a way, it's not surprising. And we knew in the months leading up to this, McConnell has talked about that this deal will not hold any water. If there's any binding aspect of it or the legality of it needs to go through Congress, that it won't pass Congress. And so Obama and the State Department has said, that we'll do what we can to work around that. And so we've always known that there was going to be a lot of heel dragging, but this idea of attaching writers to the and year-end budget in order to kind of spook India or spook other actors away from the deal is a new development and something that has come up sort of in the last couple of weeks, kind of mid-November. Some senators sent a letter to President Obama, kind of outlining this, and then they held hearings as well that sort of underlined that idea.
It reminds me of what they tried to do to undermine the Iran negotiations as well. I mean, the idea of getting right in the middle of diplomacy like that. And also, by the way, just some of the quotes you used in your article on Republicans and the climate talks. I mean, this is me editorializing, but Natasha Geiling, but they seemed so short-sighted. Donald Trump, for example, saying, while the world is in turmoil and falling apart in so many ways, especially with ISIS, our president is worried about global warming. What a ridiculous situation. Well, that seems to me to be exactly backwards, that, we're going to be the globe is going to be paying the price, the entire human race paying the price for global warming forever, and he's worried about a temporary, however serious threat. So that to me was really troubling too.
Absolutely. I mean, and when it comes to things like ISIS, which of course are short term, I mean, or long term, but deep and pressing and immediate issues, there is some research that's been done that links climate change to national security, and that it's a threat multiplier, and that it creates a scarcity of resources, water, food shortages, tends to mobilize migrations from rural areas to cities, which then puts a lot of pressure on city and municipal governments. And so we'll see larger waves of climate refugees, which can lead to unrest in that way.
And I think there's a fairly credible
Report.
I think there's a fairly credible argument to be made that there's a relationship between climate change and ISIS itself. So
Yeah, in
uh,
Syria. Yeah,
it's all right. So there's another week to go, right? It ends Friday of next week, right?
yeah, the 11th. So yeah. Right.
So you will be there for the remainder of it, I guess, and we'll be reading your reporting on this, and maybe when it's all over, you'll come back and give us a wrap up if you're willing.
Absolutely, would love to.
All right. Well, again, Natasha Geiling, climate reporter with Think Progress. Thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks so much.